The much-wanted summit meeting between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin has ended in Alaska. What has been achieved? Well, on the face of it, no ceasefire, no deal. 3-hour-long conversations were held, following which came a press conference that lasted only a few minutes. No questions were taken. So what did Donald Trump say? He said that there is no deal until there is a deal. They've made some headway on some broad points, but in the end, he's now left it to Zelensky in Ukraine to come to a broader agreement with Russia. What did Vladimir Putin come and said? Well, first of all, and perhaps most importantly, he seems to have indicated that if a different president had been in office, indicating Donald Trump in 2022, perhaps the war would not have taken place. In fact, he seems to have suggested that the war would not have taken place if Donald Trump had been in office. Now, what that means probably is that circumstances were created that led to a war in Ukraine that could have been avoided. Maybe they could be, at this point of time, very difficult to gauge. The only thing we can gauge is, are the guns going to stop firing on both sides in Ukraine? The answer seems to be that at this point of time, no. Vladimir Putin has now invited Donald Trump to Moscow for a further conversation. Donald Trump has come out and said that he might have to, quote unquote, take heat on that one, but he is not ruled out visiting there. Now, what does this all mean for global affairs? Now, let's sum it up. Will there be a ceasefire very shortly? Probably unlikely that that is going to take place anytime soon. Is there going to be an end to the war in Ukraine? Perhaps in the next few months, perhaps in the next 6 months. Difficult to say. For Donald Trump, this was a matter of importance and a matter of prestige. So what has he achieved here? Well, first of all, he's at least broken the lack of communication, the forced isolation of Vladimir Putin, and a judgment call has probably been made that it's better to talk and make a deal than to either side convince each other that they can still have an outright victory, given the fact that the situation on the ground seems to be a stalemate. So a conversation perhaps is a good deal. Can you make a deal without the Ukrainians sitting on the table? Obviously not. So was this summit going to sign a deal? No. Which will then mean that the Ukrainian side and their leadership will also at some point of time have to decide whether they are willing to have a conversation directly, publicly with Vladimir Putin. It is perhaps inconceivable that an agreement will be reached between the Russians and the Ukrainians without some sort of direct conversation happening. In the past, it has been indicated from Moscow that no deal could be reached until there was a change in leadership in Ukraine, which of course is a Ukrainian decision to make, not necessarily a Russian or an American decision to make. So how does this affect the broader context of what is happening in the world? Well, primarily, the end of the war in Ukraine would be good for the Ukrainians, good for the Russians, who are the people whose soldiers and people are suffering and dying. Moreover, it probably would be good for the entire global community. The airspace around Ukraine would open up. We would see an ease in oil sanctions. We would see a greater flow in the economy, which we'll have to face facts is facing a lot of tumult, primarily because of so many tariff announcements that have come from Washington, which none of have stabilized till this point of time. So it's impossible if you're sitting in Asia, if you're sitting in Europe, if you're sitting in South America, even in places where deals have been struck with Europe and Japan, to be predictably certain of what the tariff rate will be 2 months from now, 3 months from now, and what deal has been achieved from one side or on the other side. It would seem that Donald Trump is intent that there be peace, which is a cause worthy of the effort. Is Vladimir Putin intent on peace? I think the answer would be peace, but on what terms? The Russian terms are pretty strong, I don't think they have weakened over the course of the past 2-3 years. That they are convinced that they are, whether third parties may believe it or not or perceive it or not, that they have convinced themselves that if they have made the effort and made the sacrifice over these many years, unless there is a pivotal change that takes place in strategic policy, the ground reality is what they have to maintain, and the ground reality is the claims on territory that they have in Ukraine. Can the Ukrainians easily, after having suffered so much over the past few years, cede territory to Russia? A reasonable question then would be asked that what was the point of the suffering if you were to cede the territory in the first place? So then comes to the strategic issue which probably started the entire conflict. Ukrainian entry and membership of NATO and the European Union, neither of which have happened till date. So the question then is that while the Ukrainians have self-determination in deciding whether they would like to join one or two of these organizations or bodies, will those organizations or bodies A, still invite them, and B, not stall the process of their entry, which they have successfully done for the past 3 years? Because if you look back, there was already a border and territory issue between Ukraine and Russia that's been going on since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Matters have come to a head in the past, but a full-scale war to the extent of what has taken place in the past few years has not happened in decades. So what was the trigger point? The trigger point, as far as the Russians are concerned, was the invitation to entry into NATO, then bringing NATO forces, NATO alliances, perhaps even NATO weaponry to the borders of Russia. The second was the European Union, NATO being the larger contextual problem. So where does this put us in the overall picture? The overall picture, ladies and gentlemen, remains that Ukrainians have died and suffered. There are Russians who have died and suffered. Neither side has got or can claim to have gotten an outright victory. Ukraine has managed to deal Russia a difficult time primarily because of the near limitless supply of foreign weaponry that has come into the Ukraine. For those who are convinced that the Russians are completely bedraggled and defeated, the answer is, well, they've seen worse. They've seen worse in the hands of Napoleon, they've seen worse at the hands of Hitler, and the reality is Russia didn't give up, fought back, and did a reasonable job of it at the end. So if a Russian capitulation was being expected by any quarters, that would have probably been an unreasonable expectation, and at this stage would be an unrealistic expectation. So the Russians aren't going to walk away. The Ukrainians can't walk away. It's their own territory. So what do we do to find peace? That's the extremely large question that needs to be addressed. Now, how does this context refer to the other issues that are going on? If there was an agreement that would be reached between Russia, the United States, NATO, and Ukraine, for other countries, what impact would that be? For the immediate neighborhood of the European Union, it would be a huge sigh of relief. While in the past few years, they've been forced not to do business with Russia, they could certainly use the Russian oil and gas if it was available back on the international markets. Having it available back on the international markets benefits the world. It does not necessarily benefit A, the Americans who are also selling oil and gas into the international market, or the Chinese who have been getting cheap oil and gas from Russia because Russia has been facing a lack of other options to sell. When it comes to the trade talks between India and the United States, for example, which will have to formally resume at some point of time, if the situation in Ukraine was in a better position, the extreme reaction, or at least the extreme pretext for a reaction that is being taken in Washington on the reason for heavy tariffs against India, primarily revolving around the purchase of Russian oil, well, that would ease a little bit. And The big question that, of course, everybody needs to ask here is, what is China's role and position in all of this? Have the Chinese, both economically, strategically, diplomatically, and through other means, supported the Russians in this? Yes, they have. Has this suited the Chinese establishment, that the heat is off them? For sure, it has. And if the entire summary to the background of where this all began was actually that the Americans were considering China the threat and not Russia, and were perhaps reasonably concerned about a forever partnership that was building between Moscow and Beijing, and if the assumption that was being made was that, okay, if we can't deliver a direct blow to the Chinese to cut them down to size, well, we can cut the Russians down to size. How much of success has been achieved in that, besides people dying, not Americans dying, not Europeans dying in the sense of NATO allies, but Ukrainians dying and Russians dying without a final word on where this ends. So now all eyes on where does this go next. Will there be a meeting between Zelensky and Putin? Difficult one. Will Putin agree to meet Zelensky? Difficult one, because the Russian administration has been very clear they want a change of guard in Ukraine. Will Zelensky now look for elections in Ukraine, look for a change of regime in Ukraine? Will he resign and go for the sake of peace? Probably not. Is Putin going anywhere? Well, for 3 years, we've heard from various reports that have been put out that, well, it's end game for Putin, his health is suffering. Well, he's still here. He still seems able to be fit and fine to hold that 3-hour conversation with Donald Trump. So those sort of fanciful scenarios certainly are not working out. Has some ice been broken and some progress been made? Well, that seems to at least be the case from this conversation, given where we were a year ago. Are we closer to nuclear standoff or further away from it? We are probably further away from it. Is that a good deal for the world? Yes. But is this a final deal? The answer from Alaska is no.